development order has been changed.
Yeah.
Because those buildings are significantly higher in those particular areas when we know that in previous times they would not have been approved.
All right, so the Kingston and St. Andrew is a 1966 order, but the provisional order published is also material consideration. And the Attorney General...
When was the provisional order?
Pardon me?
When was the provisional order issued?
Last year, September. Last year, September. So, September, October. So the advice from the Attorney General, it is to be used as provisional, as material consideration. So that order allows for greater height and density and so on. So that's a reference we use. And remember now, for you to get height and density, you also have to have the available lands, eh? So the planning parameters have to be met also.
But would
second, we have
no, but
others
just,
in a queue.
Yeah, but just say on the same question. But would when looking not only on the structure itself, but would it take into consideration even factors, sewage, road, traffic?
That's correct. And I'm happy our colleagues are here, both from the Water Commission and the Works Agency. Yeah. As you know, we have a technical review committee, which is a pre-board committee, and we have representatives both from the NWC and from the NWA. There are different views, member. Do you not allow development because there's a traffic problem on the road? Which one comes first? Or you're going to, as I see a letter in the newspaper recently, or you're going to order your city to allow for walkability, allow for persons to walk to work. Most big cities in the world, well, you don't expect to drive into the city to find a car park.
No, but Mr. Knight, to tell the truth, I mean, you know, looking at where most of these orders are 30 years old or older, like the Kingston St. Andrew order, and looking at what has taken place in most of our major towns right across the island. We can use Ocherous as an example. I can use Mandeville as an example, where it has just become untenable to even operate within the town itself. That I would have thought that these developmental orders would have been an urgent matter, despite which government is in power, but an urgent matter to deal with. You know, so, I mean, you can't even drive in the town of Mandeville, even if it is an emergency, as it is now, because we're building in and not outward. We're not dealing with the traffic situation at the same time and the drainage situation at the same time, and we're putting up more buildings within. And, you know, just with that, the part of the monitoring and enforcement, you know, I would ask the question, what would be the required amount of personnel you would need in that area? I see where the Auditor General said that there have been some improvement, but at the rate that where construction is taking place, and not only construction, but other activities island-wide, are we able to, I mean, to monitor?
Yeah, but before you answer that, I mean, the whole question of the monitoring capacity of NEPA is an issue,
yeah,
distinct from the development orders, which I think we're going to get to. But there are some other persons who...
On the same,
okay. So we can revisit
right.
that point, Member Phillips. Yes, so Member Jackson, and then Member Dunn, and then Member Daly.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, colleagues. Mr. Knight, in the narrative, you have completed for St. Catherine.
Yes.
And you're doing one distinctly for Portmore. Yes. What boundary do you use to delineate St. Catherine from Portmore?
Excellent. Thank you, Member. Chairman, I understand that we are using the boundary as determined by the municipality, the court decision on the municipality.
So you are excluding the, it is one which the mayoral election was drawn?
Yes.
Was run?
Yes.
Okay. So you have completed St. Catherine already?
Yes, we have completed St. Catherine.
And Portmore is in its draft stage?
Portmore is now with the Chief Parliamentary Council, okay. And we have invited comments from you, okay. And also from the other members of Parliament.
Mr. Knight, the entire Bernard Lodge Plain have been restricted for development, housing development, because of agricultural, designated for agricultural use. 1 and 2, it was prohibited because of the aquifers that was said to be needed to be preserved. You are aware that the government is in a big rush to dispose of all those lands for housing development and other structural industrial activities. My question is it that there's no longer a need for the aquifers to be protected in that area? And 2, first of all, are you aware of the disposal of those lands by Sugar Company of Jamaica for the purposes mentioned, and whether or not they comport with the development order as it is now?
Member, I am aware of, and we are heavily involved. You use the word rush. I don't know of a great rush. No, what I know of is a steady hand and a decision not to go to development unless there is a comprehensive master plan. And we have been asked by the Cabinet to develop a master plan for the Bernard Lodge, that entire area. Those are, I can only say that as to what is going to be done and how it is going to be done. Those are policy issues. But let me just say that in the development of the master plan, all the environmental and planning issues, because we did an environmental assessment. We have been working, all the critical agencies have been part of the process. We have looked at how we are going to protect the aquifers and also the irrigation systems. And I'm sure when the minister comes to speak on the policy thing as to how the development is to be done, those will be explained. But what we want to see and what we have put on paper, which is, and you notice I'm being very cautious because we have not gone to cabinet yet. We have just beginning to draft the submission. But we have engaged a number of stakeholders. I know that there is 2 final legs that are left, one to brief the political representatives in both Portmore and St. Catherine, and one for the development. One of the decisions we took, and we relied heavily on the agricultural land management, is that when we crafted the development plan, there are parcels of land, and when you come to see it, that, and the agriculture has asked that those is like, what you call that, those will remain in agriculture. As to what type of agriculture, I can't say. But we have clearance from the agricultural land management for those lands that we have proposed for development. But the specifications from agriculture is very clear that those lands will remain in agricultural production over the years.
Member Dunn.
Good morning again. I'd like to also wish everybody a prosperous new year. I'm happy to have heard a comment from Member Phillips about all the construction that are taking place. And I mean, some of these are a sight to behold because we need to build a modern country and a modern cities. So I am happy for some of the things which I see is happening. I'm also heartened by the fact that the Auditor General's report seems to have been a very good report on NEPA, based on the keys that are placed on the comments. The question I'd like to ask is, Sir Knight, you mentioned that the fees and collecting the fees is an issue right now, and you're looking at a percentage of fees to be collected upfront. What percentage fee are you referring to, and what mechanism would it be used at in arriving at those fees? And for a question, which I'm not sure, but would it become a disincentive any at all for timely submission of any development or projects if the upfront fee itself is too high?
Thank you, member. I would readily say no. You'd be surprised that our customers, and I don't want to sound as if I'm not caring, but persons don't so much worry about fees. What they worry about is a service, an efficient service. So when we move the application fee, for example, and that is as a result of intervention from the Auditor General in 2010, we have been working at it. So when we move the application fee, let's say from $1,000 to $60,000, persons don't have any objection. What persons want is that I come and I lodge my application and you are going to give me a predictable turnaround time that I can get on with my business. So, and that has helped our bottom line also. So there are no quarrels over fees. As such, I know when we are looking at the beach regulations, one of the hospitality stakeholder has some concerns about the level of fees, and we have been working with them because we did come to Parliament, I think it's called Legislative Committee, and we were asked to do some additional consultation. But the answer is that the fee, we don't see the fee as having an impact on the application process. People readily pay their fee, but they want you to be predictable.
Member Daly, and then Member Warmington, and then Member Hanna.
Thank you, Chairman. Morning, Chairman, colleagues. Sorry to be late. Good morning, all of you, PS, students from Central High. I have 3 questions. One, what's the turnaround time now for the application approvals? And I must say I'm heartened to see the approvals. I'm heartened to see the response from the management team to the report of the Auditor General. It shows that NEPA has been seriously considering the things that you reported on, and I'm happy for that. That's one question. Secondly, how many habitable rooms per acre is now contained in the provisional development order, and where is it moving from? I don't remember how much. I'm not a developer, although I had responsibility for this portfolio once, but I don't remember.
I know.
And are you going to grandfather in the new order, development order, those apartment complexes and buildings that were built outside of the regulations prior to the new development order for Kingston and St. Andrew? That's 2 questions. My last question is the development order for Pedro Keys. What has happened since the provisional order has been promulgated? What has happened on Pedro Keys? What has taken place there?
Thank you, member. Turnaround time, let me take the first question.
And perhaps you could, in doing so, distinguish between those applications that you handle directly, for which you earn fees, yes, and those that involve building and the local authority input and so on.
Okay, Chairman. Turnaround time. There is a gold standard that is set, and we would have heard it over and over, 90 days from the time of application to the applicant obtaining approval. But that 90 days, we have to caution that where there is a requirement for an environmental impact assessment report, the 90 days is already shot because it can't be done in 90 days. So there is that understanding. So the gold standard is 90 days turnaround time. I would say that currently, most of the application, if I remember the figure off the top of my head, about 75% of the application comes out of the agency in less than 70 days. There are some that because of, and I'm going to say it here in this committee, you'll be surprised the challenges we have with the professionals who submit applications to the agency. When I say professional, I'm talking about professional engineers, professional architects, and commissioned land surveyors. And that is, they have to understand that, one, you have to use a reference to all the documents that are available to you. So the development orders, the legislation, etc. And persons tend not to prepare good submissions. And so it presents a challenge, and basically we have to be holding person's hand, and that adds to the review process. The habitable rooms per acre, it depends on the planning area. It could be 30, it could be 50 habitable rooms. For example, in the halfway tree planning area, which is where South Avenue, all of those areas, it's 150 habitable room per acre. 150. So is it also...
And that would be coming from where?
Kingston 6. Some parts are 50 and some parts would be 30. Yes, yes. Yes, no, it remains, member, but we have to be careful, you see, that when we look at the core of the city, we want to do these major high-rise and so on in the core of the city, which we are defining, but we don't want to impose on suburbs. We're not going to have the same type of intervention and development in suburbs. Remember also that the Restrictive Covenants Act also is an avenue that neighbors and property owners have, and there have been recent court cases, which I'm sure you would have read, with the Restrictive Covenant. There's a view that it should be amended, but we have to work with what we have. So the habitable room depends on the planning area. The Pedro Keys, we have published the development orders, but recall outside of the order we have prepared management plan for the Pedro Keys and the surrounding water for a number of years now. When the University of the West Indies was engaged by the then Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, to do a study of the Pedro Keys, we had contributed, meaning NEPA, heavily to that study and provided the planning framework and the guidelines as to what should be included in that study. And that study is available for us to use as reference. So the development order, I would say, I don't want to say nothing has happened, because remember it's a process, but we have a special oversight of the Pedro Keys with our partners, Fisheries and the JDF Coast Guard, in trying to regulate what happens at the Pedro Keys.
Member Wilmington?
Mr. Knight, in response to the question from Mr. Jackson, that it relates to the development order for Portmore, when he asks what area was covered, you said it was the area determined by the last court ruling as the boundary for Portmore. I want to suggest that you hold off on that, because the boundary, that boundary was the one that was determined when the municipality was established years ago, and Portmore has outgrown that area. And there is consideration right now for a new to determine the new boundaries. So I would suggest what board? With the boundary, but not that one you want. So in the process now of determining the new boundaries, not the one that we really want, but the one that we agreed on. You remember we agreed before?
Thank you.
Well, just a quick comment on that. Member, remember now, once it's published as provisional, and that's why we want and depend heavily on the members of parliament. That's why we send you the order. Well, I don't know if we send you the order, but we send you letters referring to the order and requesting your comments. Some members of parliament have been very good. They have come into NEPA to go through some of the issues with us. Remember, this is also what you would like to see as a member of parliament for your parish. Yes, no, I'm accepting that, but I'm just saying when it becomes provisional, then we will have, there's consultation, naturally we'll get policy instructions as to how to proceed.
Thank you. I think, was it you, Member Hannah, you want, yes, and then.
Yeah, I just have a final point, Mr. Knight and the PS. I think sometimes one of the things that I enjoy about coming to PAC is not only to see the reports, Auditor General, but to understand the gaps that exist in the development of our country. I want to suggest, and it's not coming from the entire committee, it's my personal suggestion as an MP and as a citizen, that NEPA gets the requisite funding that it needs. It needs to be properly under government. The environment and climate change right now is really too important in our survival as a country to have an agency having to earn its own money to do its duty and responsibility. That's one. Two, I think there needs to be a proper interministerial and technical oversight committee that probably meets once a month to look at all of the issues that coincide with what NEPA, the Parish Council, NWSMA in particular, and garbage collection have, because whether or not you work with water or you work with NWA and others, one of the biggest problems that we find facing the country is how people dispose of their waste. NWC is facing it, NWA is facing it, we're all facing it. And we will never have enough money to clean drains. You will do your development orders and all will go into naught if we continue to do those things. So I think certainly from where I sit as a citizen, seeing what I would like to happen in my country, those are some of the major issues that I think you need to tackle. Getting the requisite funds and having a proper oversight, working technical committee where all things come centrally so that you discuss all things at once, PS, and everybody knows and everybody is on the same page at the same time.
Okay. Should I comment?
Yes, please.
Just to say, thanks, Madam. Your 2 points are noted. I suppose the one in terms of the recommendation for the Interministerial Technical Oversight Committee would be a part of your recommendation to the policymakers. In terms of the funding, I can assure you that special representation was made. You know, Cabinet recently, last week, concluded its deliberations, reviewed the draft budget, and special representation was made on behalf of NEPA, considering the many constraints that they have experienced. He spoke earlier about, us, the ministry, having to find funds outside of what was budgeted to allow them to publish some of the orders. And so I know the constraints that the Ministry of Finance has, but it is under consideration in terms of what they have asked for outside of what has already been provided. So.
Member Flynn? Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I'm still not clear. The old development order agreed to 60 habitable rooms per acre. But you said that you have now, you presented a new order, July, August, and October last year, respectively, Kingston, St. Andrew. The question I was asking, what is the proposed habitable rooms per acre in the new order, in the new, having looked at, no, I heard that. I'm speaking specifically of Kingston 6 and Kingston 8. What's the new regulation? What prevails now? Yes. Because everything I see in the last 2 years or 3 years, it is beyond that.
Member, a quick reference would be there were some years that were 20 that were moved to 30, some that were 30 were moved to 50, and right in the middle of Barbican, it's 100 habitable room per acre. So it's
100
yes,
what, sorry?
100 in the middle of Barbican, not on the suburbs, the outskirts.
And that, where was it before, in Barbican?
50.
Been doubled.
Yeah.
Okay. Member Flynn?
50.
Yes.
Yeah, and don't doubt.
I just wanted to find out. I live in the Bernard Lodge area, and I'm actually happy to see an alternative for residents like myself who possibly can't afford in Kingston, but live right outside of to afford a home there. Where I'm currently living, we do get our water from a well, and we do recognize that there are some homes being built around us. I wanted to find out if you'll be engaging, or if NEPA see the importance of possibly engaging community members once you're taking on such, vast amount of construction going on when there are underground wells. Because we were facing some issues before, and I think some of the residents are a little bit concerned if we're going to have enough water to supply us for years to come. And what are you doing to protect? As you did said, there are provisions there to protect the aquifers. I guess I want some clarity on that. And if, again, you'll be possibly engaging community members when you're taking on such, large housing complex.
Thank you, Member. Again, I'm going to be a little bit cautious in speaking about the Bernard Lodge, because those are not within my purview. Those are policy issues. But for example, the master plan that we have worked on, and the president of the Water Commission is here, we engaged the president and his team, and it is the president and his team that determined the water supply, the infrastructure, all that will go into place in the Bernard Lodge area. So probably when he comes, you could ask him a little more about that detail. But we have included the advice from the National Water Commission, both for water and sewage, in the master plan. I know there's a view about how the plan is going to be marketed. That's that. But as I've said, this all depends.
Member of Parliament will ensure that she doesn't run out of water.
She's well represented.
Thank you, Member.
Mr. Knight, if I may ask a question, and it relates to enforcement. One of the comments in the Auditor General's briefing report is that the monitoring targets were not appropriately aligned with the number of approved permits and licenses. And Member Phillips had raised that earlier as an issue. And I wanted to get a sense as to I noticed that the number of enforcement actions has increased quite significantly over the review period, which is encouraging. But what are the major challenges that NEPA faces in enforcing our environmental laws and the conditions on which approvals are granted, and specifically in relation to larger projects with larger investment involved? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Chairman. And yes, the member did raise that question earlier. I'm happy that the Auditor General's team and the Auditor General herself has mentioned that there has been tremendous improvement in the area of monitoring and enforcement. Director Legal and Enforcement is here, and the Director and her team were tasked with ensuring that the recommendations of the Auditor General were responded to. But we have a number of challenges, Chairman. We have a small team, 26 enforcement officers with a manager. One response we give to the Auditor General, and rightly so, the observation is that we have placed an officer in each parish capital, that our response can be much better. So we have officers, we have regional offices and we have parish offices, but we have a small team. One of the strategy, I guess like the Auditor General, we do our own risk ranking. We have risk rank permits and licenses. So those permits and licenses that are deemed high risk, meaning that it presents a greater threat to the environment and to public health, they are given priority. I think we have somewhere in the region of 35 special monitoring, on that special monitoring list now, which means if the staff, if they do nothing else, those are to be monitored. And I think the Auditor General has found that we have done a pretty good job at monitoring those developments that are on the special monitoring list. The other challenge we have is how do we, remember we don't grant building approval. That's the municipal corporations. So we will consider the submission as a whole, because you can't do a partial submission. And I'm just putting that quickly in response to the Auditor General also. We had now have on staff a professional architect, planner, and also a civil structural engineer to ensure that we can deal with all the issues. But the challenge is, how do we have an engagement with the municipal corporations that we can work together? We have tried that over and over. There was a national monitoring and enforcement strategy before. There was the then Ministry of Environment had environmental wardens, and that added to the process. How do we work together with the parish councils who are on the at the local level to ensure that we can do a better job? Chairman, I want to make the point because I've made this point in the media before, and it's an important point. If we develop our monitoring and if we have a robust monitoring and enforcement program, then it also drives compliance. Remember, the first step is that the applicant, the permittee or licensee, your first job is to comply with the conditions. And the culture of the country, we have to begin to change the culture that the first responsibility is for the developer or the investor to comply. It's not for the regulatory agency. We are to monitor to ensure that you comply. And that is why we have done quite a bit. We now include performance bonds as an integral inclusion in permits and licenses. We also apply an administrative fee for those developments that we know are challenging and that we must have the presence there. So we are finding ways of garnering resources. So the performance bond is a good strategy. And what we do, the conditions of the bond are of such that it's tied to the permit. So those 7 or 8 conditions. We tie them to the bond. If they are breached, then we are going to call down on your bond, as we are about to do now with we may call on a bond soon. And also, the director is telling me
the increase in investigations impact our ability to monitor, and if investigations increase, then we can monitor. So,
right. So one of the challenges also, Chairman, is the increase in investigation. When we have pollution incidents or complaints and so on, that in a way takes away from the resources that are to be directed to monitor, because we have to respond to the public. So what the director was saying is that when we have requests for investigations, which we do, you'll be surprised, Chairman, I don't know the relationship, but the more we respond to our public, is the more work we get. So people say, boy, go to NEPA, they are efficient. So, and I don't want to disparage other government agencies, but things that, for example, should go to the Ministry of Health, people come to NEPA. They want, because we have developed, yes, we have developed of responding and assisting persons to overcome their issues. And the entire team at NEPA, we do a good job. Our legal team has had to be issuing, well, not doing the work for persons, but giving pro bono advice as to how you go about resolving some issues and so on.
My understanding is NEPA has prosecutorial powers in relation to offences within your statutory ambit, and therefore has carriage of the prosecution. I wondered whether the fines and penalties that apply, whether they are current or sufficient at this time, or whether they need to be upgraded.
Chairman, so we have 5 attorneys, a director and 4 attorneys in-house, and we have a fiat. They have a fiat from the DPP, which allows them to prosecute and to act independently. They appear in court. Those of you who have been following the news over the last couple of months would have seen. And one of the strategy we have developed is to publish in the newspapers or in the media names of offenders. And people don't like that, I must tell you that. And sometimes we get a bit of flack for that. But we now have about 15...
We have 19 matters on it.
19 matters in the parish courts. And the fines, the question of the fines. First thing is that the fines go to the consolidated fund. We don't get the fines. The maximum fine under the NRC Act is $50,000, and under the Wildlife Act it is $100,000. We have done the work, and I'm sure PS is going to see if we can go to legislation committee to have the amendment as recommended by the Auditor General, to have those amendments done. We want to go in the million region for fines and so on. Naturally, the courts have to fine based on what the maximum fine is under the legislation. So the fines, in a way, are not prohibitive. 2,000, 5,000.
Especially for major environmental violations.
Very.
Yeah. So that needs to be upgraded.
That's correct. And we are working on that, Chairman.
Yeah. Member Phillips, you would want to say? Mm-hmm.
You had mentioned the same officers that will do the monitoring also perform the enforcement roles also.
Yes.
Yeah? Yes. You had mentioned about how many officers in total you have working in that area.
Well, our enforcement team is 26, as I have said. But remember, most of the divisions and branches of NEPA are involved in monitoring and enforcement.
Okay.
So, for example, spatial planning is involved in monitoring.
Okay,
it depends on the area. Right.
Yeah. So
right
in
across
total,
the
so in total, how many you have? I mean,
we sent the Auditor General those numbers. I think it's about 90, 97 or somewhere there.
And my original question to you, for you to effectively carry out those functions, about how many persons would you need in that enforcement and monitoring area?
The report that somebody will do a job analysis,
yes,
job review, organizational review. The report would have noted that they have engaged a consultant to do an organizational review, so that out of that exercise, that determination will be made.
All right. The reason why I asked that is because, and you had mentioned earlier that NEPA has some jurisdiction over our beaches, and the
same enforcement.
Yeah, and we would have seen in the past, and I'm sure recently, in areas where persons start putting up informal and illegal structures on our beaches, and we tend to leave it, and then over time we see multiple structures going up on the beaches. And that's why I ask about the monitoring and enforcement. And if I'm to use even, let's use Alligator Pond as an example, with the erosion of the beach, how is it that monitored? How is it then that NEPA ensures that the requisite ministry or agency will do what is necessary to ensure that we don't lose that beach? You know, I hear you talk about bonds for, you know, those who are getting into the activity of, do government agencies require to also pay those bonds? And how are those projects that are being initiated by government? Because, I mean, truth are in fact that in many instances, those might even be the biggest culprits in their activities, you know? And is it that NEPA as an agency itself has a power to initiate action against those government agencies too? Yeah?
The quick answer with the last point you made is that, remember I made a point that the NRC Act binds the Crown, which means that what applied to Ms. Mary also applied to the government. And that's one of the beauty of the NRCA Act, because it binds the Crown. Most other legislation doesn't bind the Crown, but this one does. So to answer your question, is that we can apply sanctions across the board, as we do with some of our friends who are in here, who are going to come next. The government, the other point you made was about Alligator Pond and the beaches and so on. And we know about the erosion, and we are working on that. We're also working on Port Henderson and Hellshire and all those areas. We have a gentleman who is very consistent in working with us from the political side for the Hellshire issues. But we know what the issues are. We have to go to look grant funding or other support to get some of these things done.
Yeah, but let us use then Negril as an example, which a decision was taken on what is needed. There was some action that was started, was put into play. There was some objection from the hoteliers there, but yet still nothing has happened. While there's inaction, there's depletion of the beach that would obviously take place. I mean, at what point do we act? At what point do we act? I mean, you know, the Hellshire, I've been hearing about the Hellshire. I mean, I went out there during the Christmas, and you couldn't, well, there's soon be no structures on the beach. because the sea is right up on the structures. So when do we act? And I mean, do we hold the necessary ministry and agencies accountable? Because at some point we have to act, or else it is going to cost us 10 times more to protect and to replenish what it is that we fiddle our thumbs with.
Remember, we are acting. The Negril situation, although we didn't do the breakwater structures, there are other interventions in Negril. We have secured those funds for use in other areas of the country. PIOJ has been handling that. But we do act, and remember also that it is the Beach Control Act and the permitting and licensing program that also help to regulate what happens on the beaches, on our coastal areas. And we have had advice from the Attorney General's chambers. And so now if you're building structures over the sea, you have to get a license from the Commissioner of Lands, because it is seen as land that is owned by the state, and you have to go and get a license for those things. And that is working beautifully. So we are acting. What we need is the wider societal issues with the person's willingness to comply with regulation, rules and regulations. And that is a challenge to all areas in the society. And you'll be surprised, you have an intervention and tomorrow the persons may be back. So it's a challenge.
So with the Negril one then, have some consensus been reached? And
well, there were some
since
policy.
Since we say we're going to act now, by when we should be acting on
Well, just yesterday, one of our directors attended the Negril Green Island Local Area Planning Authority board meeting, represented me, and I know that a number of things are happening to remove squatters. We have been working with the members of parliament and the various authorities on these matters. So we are having interventions in Negril to try and restore some of the issues there. We have to get the private sector stakeholders to get involved with us.
Member Witter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Knight, given the fact that we have now had the reopening of the bauxite plant, Alpart, I think you are well aware of some of these challenges we had over the many years with the previous owners. Want to find out if you have done any reassessment of the NEPA's position as it relates to the operations there, and what is your impression as it relates to compliance and so on in respect of the new owners of Alpart?
Thank you, Member. I'm pleased to tell you that we have done extensive both regulatory and facilitative work with the new owners of the Gisco Alpart. Gisco Alpart has somewhere in the region of about 27 permits and licenses. We have been working with them. We have naturally the NRCA, Town and Country Planning Authority. It gave us a number of challenges as to how we were going to, the mechanism and the program we were going to set for the reopening. We also just last week, we have engaged a focal point who is going to be, the emphasis is to deal with all the issues at Gisco Alpart. And hopefully at any point we'll be able to say exactly what is happening there. They themselves have a number of challenges which we are working through with them. But the JBI, the Water Resources Authority, the Ministry of Health, we are working as a team to deal with all of the issues down at the plant.
Yes. As MP for the area, two of the main challenges that we had in the past are in relation to the RDA, the residue disposal site, and emissions from the operations. Yes. As I was saying, two of the main challenges that we face there is the residue disposal site and the emissions from the plant. Since the reopening, residents have expressed concerns as it relates to emissions. So I don't know if you have gotten any report as to what are some of the challenges there and their response in relation to the complaint from the residents.
Thank you, Member. The residue disposal areas are on a program for improvement for 18 months, if I recall. GISCO Alpart, we have seen preliminary designs and proposals from GISCO Alpart. They are fine-tuning the proposal based on our comments, because all of these are included in the permits and licenses that were issued. The other issue with emissions, whether it's dust or fumes, those have also been conditioned. Remember, GISCO Alport also has an air discharge license, which is, and the plant has to do self-monitoring and report the findings in addition to NEPA's oversight. So we are aware of the issues. I am not aware that there have been complaints in recent times, so probably you could brief us on that. But what I know is that the regulatory regime that we have set down to GISCO Alpart, I know that it has been seen as harsh, but that's the way we have to go.
Thank you. I think Member Bunting has a question for you, and then
Chairman,
Member Warmington.
may I just remind the committee that we're here to deal with the follow-up performance audit. And I guess not, muzzling anyone, but we should confine ourselves to that. The other questions being asked and the areas that we're going best be dealt with at the PAAC or a regular PAC meeting. But we are here to deal specifically, I believe, with the follow-up performance audit of 3 entities. But we have been going all over the field. And you must remember, it's now almost 12 and we have 2 other agencies to come. So we should try our best to confine ourselves to the specific stuff we're here to do.
Point taken. I think we're about to conclude with NEPA. Do you have anything?
Yeah, and this is, my question is consistent with the enforcement section of the audit. And it's similar to Mr. Witter's question, but with respect to the Kirkvine disposal facility. They're monitoring wells near Porous or downstream of the Kirkvine mud disposal facility. I'd asked some questions in Parliament of the Prime Minister, and in the responses, which I assume came from NEPA, it showed that the alkalinity levels in those wells were rising, still within the acceptable norms, but we had seen a sharp spike over the last year or two. Can you give an update on the situation with that and what could be causing this other than seepage into the groundwater of the mud lake residue?
Thank you, Member. I know we did a comprehensive response to questions that were tabled to the Minister, and the responses were given in the Parliament. I don't remember the details of the analyses that accompanied the report. So I can't recall us making the point that the alkalinity is increasing. That report that we prepared for the minister, we had the Water Commission's contribution as well as the JBI and the Ministry of Health. I can't remember the specific details. What I know is that we did say that there was good monitoring and enforcement, that the various permits and licenses were in place at Kirkvine and so on. But as to the analyses, I don't remember the details.
All right, could I just ask you to look back on it and just let me know, send me an email or something, just saying what would possibly cause, because there was a spike in the alkalinity to just below the upper limit of the acceptable levels.
We will, and we will send it to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Knight and your team.
Thank you, Agent.
And we will move on to the next item, which is the performance audit report on the National Works Agency. Yes, we'll be seeing you a lot, PSUL, it seems.
You can put it in your report.
Okay. Welcome to the team from the National Works Agency. And I would ask if the Auditor General would, again, kick us off with her comments on the salient issues in her briefing report.
Mr. Chairman, the audit of the NWA aimed to determine whether there was an effective quality management system to provide assurance that the country's main road network and related infrastructure are being constructed and maintained based on quality standards. I want to emphasize that the audit did not seek to assess the quality of the road network and the related infrastructure, but rather sought to identify whether or not there was a functional system in place and the extent to which an independent review of NWA's quality management system was included. There are three main items emanating from that review, as is indicated in the second slide on page 2. Well, I hope it's page 2 for you, or page 4. And chief among that was our concern regarding the quality management framework. And we recognize that the quality management framework adopted, which is related to the total quality management system, adopted by NWA, is internally driven, and this is acceptable in my purview. However, I do not believe it goes far enough, as it lacks the independent assessment to provide greater assurance that the QMS system is indeed adequate, and that is the main outstanding issue. The other two items relate to the material testing equipment. At the point in time of the audit, it was not evident that the necessary calibration was done on a timely basis, as well as the quality assurance of the road infrastructure we thought was compromised by the unauthentic quality control test results. The NWA has provided responses to all three issues. You will see from the prompt that I have accepted the explanation provided and indicated satisfied. And let me just clarify, because I believe that that may have resulted in the question that was asked earlier. The key, that blue key, generally says resolved. But for the purpose of this response, I changed it to satisfied, to indicate that it may not be resolved, but I accept that there are ongoing measures to address the issues, and on that basis, I find the response satisfactory. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Madam Auditor General. Perhaps we can hear from the National Works Agency on the first issue, which was indicated as the primary issue. You have adopted a particular framework for quality assurance, having initially embarked on the ISO approach. That was that effort was abandoned a decade ago, and I think you moved to the total quality management approach. And the question of the independence of the assessment of the efficacy of that framework has been raised. So perhaps you could respond to that issue for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman, members. Let me too wish for everyone a very productive 2018. Let me also say that there's a lot of work to be done in the field, so as soon as the committee is finished with us, we'll be able to tend to those matters. Let me for the record, wow, I think it's a setup. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Let me for the record, Mr. Chairman, members, thank the Auditor General and her staff for their continued interest in the business of the NWA and their support over time. Let me say that the Auditor General Department is one department for which we have tremendous respect, and one challenges the findings of the Auditor General's Department with great trepidation. Indeed, any such challenge portends great danger to such an individual. But you know, there comes a time when someone has to put their life on the line, and Mrs. Arlene Rowe, our head of quality, has volunteered. Oh, no, but in essence, and again, the Auditor General being very systematic and very intellectual and pleasant as well. But we did have some fighting times with her support staff. But I think we have come to a reasonable compromise. The recommendations of the department are recommendations with which we find no great difficulty. The matter of the ISO, Mr. Chairman, is one, you know, over which we had long discussion between the department and ourselves. Indeed, and in fact, yes, it is true that some 10, 12 years ago, the National Works Agency did voluntarily attempt to introduce an ISO framework for good, you know, supposedly for good reasons. That framework was subsequently abandoned, again, from my understanding, for good reasons. Now, the truth of the matter is, Chairman, there is no conclusive evidence anywhere that adopting an ISO framework necessarily translates in improved business and improved quality. In fact, if I may, you know, I have my documents here, and I can read some of the conclusions from some of the studies done in places like Malaysia, in terms of Hong Kong, and basically what it says is that the framework is not necessarily without some merit, but there is no there is no conclusive correlation between that particular framework and improved company performance.
I don't think that's being questioned. Yeah. The decision was taken, no doubt, for good reason, to not go down that road, and a different approach was taken. But the issue which is being raised is the lack of an independent element to the monitoring of that. Yes.
So I'm coming to that. So, but the point I was trying to make is that one should not confuse quality management system with an ISO framework. Okay. So the ISO framework was jettisoned and substituted with a TQM framework. And again, research of the literature will show that there are lots of enterprises that claim a competitive advantage for a TQM framework as opposed to an ISO framework. Now, I take the Auditor General's point, and there's no debate in that, that we have no independent outside persons or body who would come in periodically and examine our TQM framework and says, yes, you're hitting, or you're ticking all the boxes. That is a deficiency, and that is something that we will address. Suffice it to say, though, that the underpinnings of a quality management system includes the following, as practiced at the NWA. One, all our engineering designs are carried out by professional engineers, PE, registered with the Professional Engineers Registration Board, and by law in Jamaica, unless you have a PE, you ought not, well, you can't practice engineering solely. People without PE have to practice under the supervision of a PE. And in this room, there are at least 4 PEs, including myself as an ex-engineer. So our designs are done by PE, and the presumption there is that our engineering design will benefit from that quality. Secondly, in terms of contracting, again, the NWA as an agency of government is obliged to use contractors registered with the National Contracts Commission in the appropriate grade. So it is not up to our volition to pick and choose a contractor based on any esoteric reasons. In fact, as you well know, the new procurement law mandates that these protocols be observed. So the engineers are professional engineers. The contractors are registered with the NCC in the appropriate grade. Material that the NWA utilizes, or the NWA's contractors utilize, material certified by the Bureau of Standards and other certification agency. And again, that is similar to a system used in Sri Lanka, where it is mandated by law the types of material and from whom the material can be purchased. So that's, again, another column in the quality assurance apparatus. Quarries, all quarries utilized by the NWA for crushed stone or whatever, have to be certified by the NWA, and there is a protocol, there's a standard protocol by which these quarries are certified or the certification reduced. Equipment, again, equipment that we utilize are hired from equipment suppliers on our framework contract, which means that we use the latest equipment, not my pick or my hoe. So the final thing in the whole equation, if you design properly, you utilize the right contractor, you utilize the right material, the final cog in the wheel is the workmanship. The workmanship. The truth of the matter, Chairman, is that unlike, contrary to popular belief, the NWA actually builds very few things itself. 90% of what we do is actually done by contractors, the very contractors to which I refer. We are project management outfit. Now, perhaps one of the reasons why there was an excursion in the ISO direction previously, the NWA came out of the old Public Works Department. And if you recall, the Public Works Department had trucks and rollers and this and that. Right. And so in the early years, there was a perception that the NWA would continue that model. But that business model no longer obtains. Big enterprises no longer own fleets of equipment. There's Amoco, Red Stripe, the telephone company, JPSCO, all these big enterprises. You hire these things. You let somebody else do that. So at the NWA, we don't actually have equipment. If you look at our balance sheet, we have 3 computers and there's no asset because our asset is really our brain power. So our business model is not like a construction company. Our business model is more like a consulting engineering company. And for consulting engineering services that we provide, our international standard and Bible is FIDIC, which is the International Federation of Consulting Engineers. FIDIC is utilized in 200 countries worldwide. And may I say as well, Chairman, that this is one of the standard bidding documents which will form part of the new procurement law. It's part of it. And the prescription in the standard bidding document are FIDIC prescription. In other words, the government of Jamaica has accepted that the FIDIC prescription for the supervision, management of engineering, construction works should conform to the FIDIC prescription. So it doesn't negate having another layer of probity, may I say. So we have, as I said before, we have accepted the recommendation of the Auditor General Department that it is good. In fact, on reading the literature, it says very conclusively that having the stamp of one of these certifying agencies inures to the improvement in the reputation of the enterprise. And so we have no reason not to want to enhance our reputation. So that is a recommendation that we will pursue. We are yet to decide whether it's going to be ANSI, which is the North American, or ISO, which is more the European. But
when do you anticipate that you will have decided which way to go and will embark upon whatever pathway is required by that decision? When do you think that will happen?
We intend to do that during this financial year, but it doesn't come cheap, Chairman. These things do cost money, and they cost foreign money. We have a number of options. I have the ISO manual here that says, you can hire an ISO consultant who comes down. You put him up at a hotel, and and it tells you all the documents that you need to prepare. There is NROC, stranger of NROC has ISO designation based on my research, but NROC has the advantage. Again, Chairman, an ISO framework for a consulting engineering outfit such as the NWA and NROC works best when your partner, which is a contractor, is also ISO. So at NROC has the advantage of having a single contractor, which is BWIG, and they admit to that. So NROC, BWIG, two of them ISO, that's easy. I have 257 contractors.
What about China Harbour? Isn't that ISO?
China Harbour is not ISO.
Okay.
They're not ISO.
But that NROC deal with them too, don't they?
Yeah. Right. So again, one of the not to the best of my knowledge. It's not on their letter. They use FIDIC. Yeah. So again, one of the things that we certainly would want to have a dialogue with certainly the master builders is to what extent this quality protocol can be morphed away from the consulting engineering fraternity, which is us, and into the construction part of the business. But we certainly, in fact, we've had dialogue with NROC. I have their crib sheet in terms of their protocol, so that's what we intend to do.
Thank you. Thank you. Members, Member Phillips and then Member Daly.
And myself as well, Mr. Chairman.
And then Member Bunting.
Mr. Hunter. No, but I'm a little bit dissatisfied, and let me tell you why. Just like with NWC then, just like with NWC, National Water Commission, they themselves have to ensure that the water coming to the customer is quality water. You have the NEPA who monitors the quality of water. And
Ministry of Health.
Listening to what you're saying, it doesn't give me comfort that the monitoring for the quality, the end product, that because I just said to Member Jackson that, you know, one of your famous saying is that I am the owner of the contract. Yeah? So as if it's a Patterson around here laughing.
The ministry is the owner.
I am the owner of the contract. Eh?
No, it's the ministry is the owner.
So, no, well, be it the ministry or the National Works Agency, you know, you're one family at the end of the day. For the contractor himself to monitor his quality and then deliver, it doesn't, for me, we know what tends to happen. So I don't see why it is that I would want to go that route and not having the agency itself or an independent body ensuring that what is signed off by that contractor, what he said is X, I'm actually getting X. Yeah? And seeing the, I guess it has to come to our engineering, our design, and everything. And reading the report from the Auditor General, where from your observation, you have gotten reports from tests done that are actually fraudulent. Okay. Yep. Why wouldn't we? And despite I hear the thing about costs, and there's one thing I've learned since I've sat in this house, is when we want to find the money to do something, we find it to do it. Yeah? What we spend on road maintenance now, and just you know, upkeep on some of our infrastructure itself, wouldn't it be urgent of us as an agency, as a ministry, in us putting in that critical component of the monitoring, one, and also of the testing, whatever the results that is expected that we speak of in this report? Okay. Wouldn't it be something of urgency?
Okay, let me clarify the equation for you, Member Phillips. the usual protocol, most of the contracts are, the owner of the contract is the government of Jamaica. It's a contract between the government through the PS and the contractor. The NWA is the engineer. Under law, we're not a party to the contract. We are a participant in the contract, which means, yeah.
Well, you act on behalf of the government itself.
Coming to that, Member Phillips. Under FIDIC, the engineer, although he's employed to the owner, in English law, the expression, he's not the owner's man, because the engineer is supposed to be is a professional that balances the scales between the owner and the contractor. Okay, and again, as I said before, this is FIDIC protocol utilized worldwide. So as a professional, if I'm the engineer on a project, I am obliged professionally to take a reasoned position on issues. So for example, when a contractor makes a claim, the engineer analyzes the claim on merit and makes a recommendation to the owner whether the claim is to be upheld or rejected. Okay, so under the contract, the contractor is obliged to carry out the requirements of the contract. And if the contractor fails to do that, the owner with whom he has a contract has grounds for redress. And there's a dispute resolution clause in all the contracts. So coming to that. Now, as to the supervision, one of the elements in every contract is called contractor superintendent, where the contractor claims on the owner for the staff that he, the contractor, utilizes to monitor the works. The role of the engineer is to ensure that the contractor does what he is contracted to do, or what he contracted to do. Me, okay. So the role of the engineer, the NWA, is to ensure that the contractor does what he has contracted to do to the owner. If he fails to do that, the engineer recommends withholding of payment. So when the certificates are produced, the engineer will eliminate from the certificate those items which he considers to be not due. In terms of the analytical works now, Member Phillips, that you're talking about, the concrete test, the compaction test, I have a list here. Flakiness test, LA abrasion test, soundness of sodium, for sodium sulfate. In terms of all of these analytical tests that form part and parcel of the quality management regime of a particular contract, the protocol, the FIDIP protocol, requires the contractor to undertake these tests, and this is again standard. The contractor, however, has a choice. These tests can either be performed in a private lab or they can be performed in an NWA lab. Follow me carefully. So where the government issues a contract, the contractor has a choice between performing the required analytical works in the NWA lab or in a private lab. The truth about it, Chairman, is that statistically, 70% of all the analytical works associated with a government contract are carried out in an NWA lab.
Do you charge for that service?
We charge for that, and it's paid for. 70% is done in our lab. Now,
but how you give good, how you
coming
give,
to that.
How you give proper reading if majority equipment's
right. And as I said before, the Auditor General has not raised any fundamental issue with our analytical processes. At the time when they...
Or the 38, or the 38 fraudulent test came up.
Coming to that, I'm going to address that. Okay, so let us zero in now on the 70% of analytical works which are done in the NWA lab. At the time of the audit, there were some certificates that were missing. The equipment was actually calibrated. The Bureau of Standards had not issued the certificate, but we have data, and we have subsequently provided the Auditor General's Department with the corroborating evidence. So there's no issue with analytical works that we do. Now, you could then ask the question, if there's no issue with what you do, why not compel all the contractors to use your lab? Simple. That's called restraint of trade. Okay? And under the Fair Trade Act, we can't do that. So the contractor has the right to say, I want to do this test with you. So what we do, Mr. Chairman, the labs that the contractor would nominate, those labs are visited, analyzed, and certified by the NWA. That certification it lasts for, Arlene? For 2 years, and the certification can be withdrawn if the quality profile of that lab does not match the requirement of the NWA.
Could I ask the regime under which that is done, whereby the NWA does this assessment of these private service providers and certifies them and can withdraw the certification, etc. Is that governed by any regulations, or is that an administrative construct that you've put in place as of necessity?
It is not, and the peril in that process, Chairman, is that we do it in our interests. If there's another entity of government or anybody else who utilizes those labs, we can't speak to the level of proficiency with respect to those other entities. We only certify those labs.
But those labs, before you even started your certification, are they certified by the Bureau of Standards?
No, they're not. They're not. They're not. But there are about 6. There are about 6 or 8 of them.
No, but then but then
they don't.
No, but
they don't certify materials testing lab. So
they don't certify those types of.
No, but Mr. Hunter just spoke about his equipments having certification from the Bureau of Standards.
Calibration. Okay, so calibration of equipment as opposed to certification of the entire process.
Yeah, but no, well, I'm talking about the equipments that are being used. Wouldn't it, in the same way that the Bureau of Standards, when your equipments are being calibrated, right? And I mean, I would imagine that you would want to use an agency such as the Bureau of Standards to ensure that those labs that you're using, the equipments are.
But I think so. I think he's drawing a distinction between the calibration of the equipment. I won't speak for him. I want Mr. Hunter explain the situation.
Okay. Right. So follow me now. Say they are Philips Lab and Dalil Lab, and the contractor says, I want to use Dalil's lab. Then we would go to Dalil's lab and we would assure ourselves as to the protocol of quality at Dalil's lab, and that would include calibration of the equipment, which is one. We'd look at the staff, we'd look at the qualification of the staff, we'd look at a range of things. And I can tell you, whenever we withdraw our certification, it becomes contentious. So there are things that we look for, whether there's a repeat of a lab technician across labs, because they have to give us their personnel, their profile, and so on and so forth. So we assure ourselves in respect of the quality of the nominated lab. We have no jurisdiction and prerogatives if the contractor does not nominate the particular lab. That's not our business. So we're only concerned with a lab if that lab is going to do work on a job which has been issued by the government of Jamaica. Okay.
Who's responsible for the calibration of the equipment?
Bureau of Standards.
The Bureau of Standards.
Right.
And that would apply in...
And that would apply, that would apply, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I...
Yeah, it would apply, okay. But the calibration of the equipment, is only one part of the equation. Okay, yeah, okay. I was just going to conclude by just addressing now the matter of the private lab and the submission of the test results. About 3 years ago, as we relate to the Auditor General, we got a call from another government entity to say they had discovered some fraud in their operation. And we were asked to check our records to see if there was any evidence of that in our operation. And I recall I went straight to then Minister Davis, outlined the matter to him, and he said, throw the book at them, may the chips fall where they may. And so we took a very, well, not an aggressive posture, but we took a responsible posture. The police were called in, and the police, we did interviews, The Office of the Contractor General came in and did their findings. We gave evidence. And we were able to identify a number of contracts that were compromised. And how it works is this. The test results came in on company stationery like all other things. But it turns out that the company said, verily, we did not authorize that. So on the face of it, the results were all genuine. Now, again, Chairman, may I say for the record that at this point in time, that is still an allegation, because notwithstanding the Contractor General's investigation and notwithstanding the police's investigation, we have not been told conclusively whether or not a fraud was actually perpetrated or this was a hoax. But sufficient to say that based on that incident, we have, in discussion with the Auditor General, enhanced our protocols regarding receipt of lab results from private labs. So whereas previously we would take it on the letterhead with the company stamp, I think, we now require letterhead, company stamp, and 2 signatures, not 1.
Do not call the issuing agency to ensure that it's verified.
Okay.
That's quite an important
step. We do. And in the Auditor General's report, there is a suggestion that what we should do is to have a direct transmission of the result to us, bypassing the contractor. We have not jettisoned that idea entirely, but the contract for the lab work is a contract between the lab and the contractor. And under the principles of privity of contract, as you well know, our excursion into that arrangement has to be moderated. Yes. So I do not know if legally we can, we would have to get the contractor's consent.
Yes.
Or something like that.
You would have to build that into the framework.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. So it is not something that we can do unilaterally, but certainly we look at that. So that is what. Yes. So that, Member Phillips, that was the incident that gave rise to that concern. And we have enhanced our protocols in the wake of that.
Member.
Oh, by the way, let me just add as well. The contracts, the actual contracts that were compromised as a result of that allegation were subsequently investigated by ourselves to find out if there was any compromise in the quality of the work. And our internal report said no. However, we also got the Contractor General. The Contractor General, on his own volition, did an audit of those contracts and produced a report, which we also shared with the Auditor General to say, and Mark, I'm sorry to say this, said the only deleterious effect noted in their investigation was as a consequence of recent Water Commission work. So the evidence, Chairman, at our disposal based on this incident does not support a contention or a position that the actual works were compromised.
Thank you, sir. Member Daly.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Hunter, thank you very much for that lecture on quality control. But I want to be practical, because the people of Jamaica who have seen substandard work are not privy to this kind of explanation from a learned engineer like yourself. And although you're a consultant engineering company, you still have the remit to monitor the public purse, the taxpayers' money. Because you're not a road constructing company, as you have said, like the PWD of the past. You monitor these large contracts except where you do your own internal work, emergency. So take us through practically You award a contract, you have 275 contractors. You award a contract to a grade 1 contractor. Grade 1 contractors in Jamaica, YP Seaton, Bill Wright, Construction Solution.
21 of them.
21 of them. Big companies.
Yeah, right.
Alcar, etc. You award a contract to one of these large contractors who has 7, 8 contracts from government and from private sector. And they subcontract to some grade 2 or grade 3 contractors for base work, etc., etc., etc. How does the NWA monitor those subcontracts so that quality work is delivered to the people of Kellits, where that contract is going on right now? I just want you to take us through that.
Okay.
And 2 things. If the NWA is the owner of the contract, you can determine the lab that they use for their material testing. And that is not a breach of any laws in Jamaica. If there are only 7 laboratories that are certified for material testing, and you know, Gentech is one of the leading laboratories for that, and others are coming up. Why can't the NWA say for this $1.3 billion work from Soursop turn to Chapelton, we, the owner of this contract, using taxpayers' money, determine that you use one of the following laboratories for your material testing?
But I think there.
Could I suggest you answer the first one first, and then before we get to the question of nominating who does the actual testing?
Okay, so when Jackson's engineering construction company wins a contract, and the contract is approved by all the levels. So, okay, the contractor then sends in his insurance and his bonds, and we usually have a project manager assigned to that particular contract, and that project manager may be associated with other support staff. In some instances, for example, on the Junction Road project, we will hire an outside consultant, such as Stanley, and Stanley then mirrors our responsibility. But where we nominate our internal staff, the staff will then meet with the contractor. They'll do a walkthrough. The contractor produces a schedule of how he's going to do the work, and the staff liaises with the contractor. There's a quality plan which the contractor under the contract is obliged to prepare and submit, and that is prepared, submitted. It goes to Mrs. Rose's shop, and they analyze that for all the different tests and the schedule of the different tests. The project manager is required to exercise the diligence to be on site, because there is an information requirement. The contractor has to say to the project manager, based on the schedule, that between the 5th of January and the 10th of January, we'll be pouring concrete. The project manager then knows that he has to be there to see, and so on and so forth. Obviously, where there's a weakness in the system is where a project manager has multiple sites, and you get into issues, well, he wasn't there when that was done, and so on and so forth. And we recognize internally that that is sometimes a problem. The question is, why don't you have more project managers? Well, we have, but that's another thing. But there's site officers, and as I tell my engineers, back in the day when I was a young engineer, I think we call a site diary. And a site diary, every single thing on site is recorded in your site diary. So you go to your site diary at any point, 3 years after, 5 years after, and you see written down what transpires on the site that day. Okay, we all, our lab also does periodic project audit. So they would go there independent of the project person, because to the extent the project person may be compromised for whatever reason, the lab does, quality assurance does their independent audit. the contract entered into between the government and the contractor is very prescriptive in terms of the role of the contractor, the role of the owner, and the role of the engineer. The engineer is basically king. The engineer rejects work if it doesn't pass the tests, and the contractor is obliged to redo the work. Where the contractor is behind schedule, the engineer is obliged to advise him, and it gets to a certain point, you can levy liquidated damage. The contractor, variation, as you know, variations are proposed by the contractor, analyzed by the engineer, and if it finds merit, is recommended to the owner for approval, and that's done. The works are measured. The works are measured on an ongoing basis. There's no such thing as a bridge being built and completed, and then you go and inspect. When the foundation is, when the site work is done, it's measured. When the foundation is, when the steel is bent, that's measured. When the concrete is poured, that's measured. Any errors made on certificate 1, even if the contractor is overpaid on certificate 1, it is corrected on certificate 2. That's why certificates are called interim certificates. And a series of interim certificates are issued to the contractor. When the project reaches 95%, we call that practical completion. And at that stage, the contractor can turn over the product to the owner, and the owner then uses it. The importance of that is that the insurance that the contractor usually takes out then ends, and the owner now has it. At that point in time, retention would have been held. So every certificate that is issued, a portion is held for retention. And the retention is usually 10% up to a maximum of 5% of the contract value. The retention period generally varies with the size of the contract. If it is a big contract, usually 6, 9 months, sometimes a year. For small contracts, less than 6 months. Now, I've heard it said, well, why not have a longer retention period? Again, if you're a contractor and you're required to, you know, for a longer contract retention period, you pay for that. So it's not a gimme. You know, it's cost and value. That basically, Member Daly, is how it works. The truth is that for most of our major works, Chairman, there's very little issue. For example, the road you mentioned, Source-up Turn to Chapelton, with all the flood that took place in May, there was no issue with the quality of that. That road stood up. I've been out there several times, the road stood up. Most of the contentious issues, Chairman, have to do with our small works, our patching, and our maintenance, as distinct from projects. Our projects have a certain apparatus that takes care of issues. And if you look at all the big projects that we have done, there's very little issue with quality. Now, maintenance. Why do we have a maintenance problem? Mr. Chairman, every road you build has an engineering life. And what the engineer manual says, you build me like this, I will last for this time. Most we use asphaltic concrete as our driving surface. The manuals tell you 7 years usually, 10 years maximum. And after that time, you're supposed to do an intervention. I put it to you, Chairman, as I've often said. The roads in Mona Heights are built in 1958, somewhere there. Huh? Yes, yeah, asphaltic. Yeah, man, asphalt. Yeah, for the original road. I put it to you that there's not been any intervention since. Yeah? I read where my learned friend, Dr. Monroe, you know, there was some demonstration in St. Thomas, and he attributed the potholes on a St. Thomas road to quality. That road probably was the one Paul Bogle walked on to Spanish Town. The fact of the matter is, our portfolio of roads, Mr. Chairman, is old, they have not been sufficiently maintained over the years. I mean, if you can ask someone at either university to do an analysis of the provision in the fiscal document for maintenance over the last 10 years. And when you see the total quantum of monies allocated for maintenance, NWA has 5,000 kilometers of main roads. The local councils have 25,000 kilometers for the municipal councils. The Ministry of Agriculture, I think, have over 4,000 kilometers of farm roads. And there are thousands of kilometers of roads that nobody owns. Yeah. So when you drop into your friendly neighborhood pothole, Chairman, chances are, statistically, chances are it's not an NWA pothole, okay? Yeah. Notwithstanding, we acknowledge and accept that we can always do a better job, especially with the little ones. It's really the little works that cause the annoyance. To wit, I was just about to mention. But yeah, but this time, Member Jackson, under the auspices of the National Growth Council, the NWA and myself, the NWA, NWC, and the NIC were called to the National Growth Council, had a discussion, and although we have had a protocol over the years, we have now agreed on an enhanced protocol. Quite simply, no, coming to that.
Please let him finish.
Coming to that, yeah. We both conclude that there's not a lot of issue with the big projects. Source Upturn to Chapelton, the water supply infrastructure is embedded in that contract. So that's good cooperation. Belmont to Scotts Cove in Westmoreland, embedded in that, no problem. On the Mid-P program, Chairman, the NWC and ourselves did a presentation at Cabinet, and it turns out that the NWC infrastructure associated with the Mid-P program would cost 42 million US. That is the price of collaboration. So collaboration between NWA and NWC is not a notional concept. It's not me shaking hands. It means a coincidence of financing. They must have the money when I have the money. And to the credit of the government, 42 million US dollars have been provided to the NWC to install sewer works and water works associated with the Mid-P program. And that is a big positive. The little projects now, NWC and ourselves, we have agreed that all road repair works done on NWA roads will be repaired by the NWA. Because in some instances, it used to be done by the NWC, some by us. And then you get into, who fixed that? Is it me or is it you or whatever? We have agreed that anytime you see a cut on NWA road, it's me. You call me. It's my responsibility. Don't call the NWC. That's one. Two, the KSAC was in on the discussion. They were represented by the town clerk and the deputy mayor. They have said that they want a similar protocol as well. So,
Mr. Chairman, on a point of order, Mr. Hunter is taking in excess of 20 minutes lecturing us in response to each question. I think he's now in danger of being accused of filibustering this committee. We have other members have questions to ask, and his lectures go way outside the scope of the original question. So I think you need to contain him, Mr. Chairman, and limit his talking time, as I recognize that he has not changed since I employed him to the Water Commission 20-something years ago. And he has a method of talking you into the ground. So, Mr. Chairman, you need to contain him, or we will get no more questions today.
Okay. I'm less familiar with his modus operandi than you are, but I'm actually keen to hear the rest of what he's saying. Yeah. So please proceed.
Thank you. Yeah. Member Daly did ask, what's the road for member?
Yeah, but don't go back to that road. You were talking about the KSAC wanting a similar protocol. So
Right. So the The KSAC will have a similar protocol as ours, where there's a cut on KSAC or Municipal Council road, they will be responsible for fixing it. The NWC will finance the repairs, whether it's being done by us or it's being done by the Municipal Council. And it is all, the intention of the entities to roll this out to the other municipal councils. Okay.
Thank you.
Finally, on subcontracting, Member Daly. Okay. Okay. Again, under FIDIC is very clear. A main contractor shall not subcontract any of the works without the prior written consent of the owner, which is, so the YPC or whomever would submit to the engineer a proposal to subcontract portions of the work. The engineer satisfies himself that the works to be subcontracted is within the competency of the nominated, of the subcontractor being nominated, and the permission would be given. Notwithstanding the operation of a subcontract, the main contractor is responsible for the actions of the subcontractors as though they were his own acts.
That's the privity rule, again, at play. Okay, thank you. And in the other issue as to why you don't select who should do the testing rather than the contractor, you already explained that, but it's been asked again, so perhaps you could just clarify.
So when a contractor gets a contract and he submits his QC plan, his quality control plan, he indicates which lab he wants to use. And it has to be one of the approved labs or the NWA lab. But again, because there's a contractual arrangement between the contractor and the lab house, and it is our view, and reliably so, that we cannot prescribe to we can't force him to use us, but we can force him to use one of the labs that we certify if he wants to use a private lab.
Yeah, Member Bunting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I listened to the beginning of Mr. Hunter's characterization of the NWA as a consulting engineering firm. And I can't accept that, because as he pointed out, a consulting engineer, in a sense, is a sort of independent professional who doesn't represent the interests of one party or the other. I think the NWA's role must be more analogous to a project manager who is the owner's representative. And the project manager employs, whether the consulting engineers, the quantity surveyor, the architect, whatever the independent professionals are, to assist in the monitoring and the quality control of the project. So I'm puzzled, and I can't say I'm convinced, I'm persuaded as to the NWA now suddenly characterizing itself as a consulting engineering firm. Because if that is the case, then which agency is looking out for the interest of the owner? Because certainly the PS is not out there and involved in the management of these contracts. So she's not looking out she's not able practically to represent the owner. There's no other project manager separate from the NWA. So who is representing the owner and the taxpayers in this regard?
Mr. Hunter?
Mr. Chairman, you know, when I respond to my former chairman, you know, I have to respond with the greatest degree of decorum. Yeah?
You can be succinct.
But with the greatest of respect, you know, whether the chairman agrees or not is moot. The truth is, FIDIC and our protocol have been contested in English courts over and over again. And a simple research of the protocol will tell you a couple of things. One, it is not unusual for the engineer to be employed by the owner. That is one. Secondly, as a professional engineer, once the engineer is named in the, because the engineer is named in the contract. FIDIC here, Member Bunting, and I can lend you this document, yeah, which is part of the government's procurement mechanism or apparatus. And it sets out the role and function of the engineer. Yeah? So this is not my invention. This is the prescription of the Procurement Act. When you say that being the engineer does not inure to the benefit of the program, again, that is contestable. The role and function of the engineer under the contract is to see to it that the contractor performs the contract that he entered into with the owner. And to the extent that the contractor does that, the contractor would have fulfilled the requirements under the contract. And again, as I said before, these are settled. When you read FIDIC and you look at the different case studies, it says this is settled law. So this is not my invention. I'm merely
What role does it give the project manager?
Beg your pardon?
Or where does a project manager come in under this framework?
Okay, so then, as I explained before, in the contract signed between the government and the contractor is paid for what's called the contractor superintendents, which means the contractor has to provide a sufficiency of staff with the right qualification, experience, or whatever to see to it that the work is done. So that is on the contractor side. And the owner pays the contractor for that. That's a line item in the bill of quantity. On the engineer side, the engineer then has a staff. As I said before, we have project managers, supervisors, site inspector, who has a watching brief for what the contractor does. And
are you drawing a distinction between being a consulting engineering firm and being a project management firm? You would sort of use them interchangeably. Do you see them essentially as the same thing for this purpose?
Okay. A consulting engineering firm can do one of two things. It can just do design and consulting. So it does the design for everything. It need not do the construction supervision. So usually, if you're going to build a road, you can hire Stanley or whomever to do the design. And they hand you the design that will have the contract documents, the specification, all the drawings. And that can be the end of his engagement. You then issue another contract for what's called construction supervision. The industry has two poles. The engineer who designs, should he supervise, or you want to have separate? And there are arguments on both sides. So, at the NAA, we do a lot of designs, but we also commission for designs. So, for example, under the MIDP program, Marcus Garvey extension, for example, China Harbor has a design and build contract. So they design China Harbor, they hand the design to us. Our engineers analyze the design, critique it, make adjustment, whatever, until the end of that process, there's a design that we sign off on. That design is then converted to a contract document that has the work thing. And we supervise that. So the NAA takes part in the design process, and we also take part in the supervision process. And we get a fee for that.
And that's project management.
And that's project management part of it.
Could this then be a semantic
difference?
Because what you are describing to me sounds like project management. You sometimes refer to it as project management. You have project managers, but then in your overview, you were at pains to describe yourself as a consulting engineering firm, or analogous to a consulting.
Distinct from a contractor. As distinct from a contractor.
But you are not making the distinction between a project manager. You are making the distinction
I wasn't.
So, and my difference in my own mind, and perhaps this is what is causing my misunderstanding, because a project manager, in my mind, represents the owner. and therefore he is looking out for the interest of the owner in his project management activities. While an engineer or any of the other professionals on the site, on the project rather, notwithstanding the fact that whoever pays them, they may be paid by the owner, but they're an independent professional making a judgment based on the facts in front of them.
Yeah, but Member Bunting, I'm a professional engineer, yeah? And I have to have my stamp or whatever. Whether I'm employed by the government or whomever, I'm obliged by the ethics of my profession to take a professional position. So, not because I'm employed by the government, I can't be biased. No, so there's a difference, you have to strike a distinction between looking out for the interests of the owner as opposed to being biased towards the owner. And that is the difference. And that is why the English law says, notwithstanding the fact that the employer employs the engineer, he is not the employer's man, meaning that he is constrained to exercise his professional judgment and his professional ethics in the conduct of his job.
Okay. I think the Auditor General wanted to say something.
Thank you. Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing for my intervention. I just want to put it in context that in scoping this audit, it wasn't relevant to us whether the NWA identified itself as a project manager or as a consultant, but fundamentally that the NWA is a public interest entity that should represent the people of Jamaica. And as such, all its actions must bear in mind the public interest. It is for that reason why we insist on an independent quality management system. And I stated earlier that whereas I accept the total quality management, it is a principle that is internally focused. An independent quality management system is externally focused and it addresses the needs of the stakeholders, which as a government entity, you are expected to meet the needs of your stakeholders. I want to add to say that precedent has been set for the adoption of the ISO. Mr. Hunter referred to NROC. There is BSJ, and there is also the OUR, and there are others as well. We're not imposing that it should be ISO or another acceptable independent quality management system, but that we do not believe that it should be arbitrary that a public interest entity determine whether they should adopt an international standard or not in the interest of the public. I also accept that FIDIC is a standard, and as you say, it's a Bible, in the same way that the international standards on auditing is a Bible to us. However, let me add that as in keeping with the implementation of any standard must be a quality assessment mechanism. And that is what we're speaking about. You need a quality assurance mechanism to ensure that the very standards to which you proclaim that you are adhering to are in fact being adhered to. It doesn't matter. It's in my mind, it is irrelevant whether you are a project manager or a consultant. The fact is that you are a government entity, and the public's interest must be paramount. It is in that regard. And in fact, I can say too, that in scoping our audits, we determine the public interest, what we believe the public would be interested in, and we believe that this is a matter the public would be interested in. I think that compliance with a standard and a quality assurance mechanism does not only give you the benefit of compliance, but it also builds the confidence of those who you are supposed to be providing that service to. It is along that line, Mr. Chairman, that this report. I have heard Mr. Hunter allude to the fact which we had an issue with before, but I heard him say that he has now accepted that a quality management system, an independent quality management system should be adopted. Whether it is ISO or another is yet to be determined. The NWA indicated that there's a total quality management framework. Let me reiterate that though we have requested that framework, we have not received it. And as such, we cannot speak to the robustness of that internal documentation. And that, by and large, Mr. Chairman, is the concern, the outstanding concern of this department. Thanks.
Just to ensure I understand, you haven't received the framework, but you're also concerned that the system of quality assurance lacks an external focus, meaning that there must be some external independent review of its efficacy, and it can't entirely be the persons within the organization saying that they're doing it properly. Is that
certainly, and let me add to that to NWA's credit. NWA, as far as 2001, recognized the need for this type of system, and in fact embarked on that journey to adopt the ISO. Clearly it was a daunting task, and they decided to abandon and to focus more on a total quality management system. Hence our concern. In addition to that, the periodic audits were also conducted based on their own business processes, and that has also been abandoned. So there is not an internal assessment. It has reconvened, Mr. Hunter?
Yeah, that's an error. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, Chairman, I thought that we had settled matter when it comes to the perspective of the Auditor General. I mean, as I said before, one challenges the Auditor General's position with great trepidation. And so I have no such inclination. So as far as I'm concerned, those are settled. They are settled matter. We have no, there's no dissonance between the position of the Auditor General's Department and our position. And our position. I was merely responding to questions that were being asked of me, which were not entirely within the ambit of the submitted report. And indeed, and in fact, Mr. Chairman, the final point I would make is that perhaps Parliament, and based on my many appearances here, I think perhaps Parliament, when Parliament is being reconvened in a new session, it would be useful to have persons such as my entity present to Parliament what it is that they do, because I find there are a lot of differences between what is prescribed for us and what is perceived by them. Yeah? And all I'm saying is this. I've heard, I've been here, we are,
just to encapsulate and wrap up this issue. So you have taken on board the suggestion of the Auditor General, the recommendation that there be an independent element to your quality assurance process, and I think said that you intended to make a decision on which way to go this financial year.
Yes. Whether it is ANSI, which is a North American, because nobody in North America uses ISO. Right. Yeah. So it's whether it is ISO or ANSI or whatever, we will examine that. Yeah.
Any other? Yes.
There was one small issue in making the determination as to the TQM which your department follows. I noticed that there's an emphasis on the use of the FIDIC international agreements. Right. When you draw up one of these agreements, or when you use one, where does the National Works Agency fit in the clause-by-clause construct of that agreement? Or is it just adopted wholesale, or we do some kind of amendment?
Okay. FIDIC actually has, I think, 3 different protocols. And there's the, what call again? There are standard conditions and there are special conditions. So whenever we're going to enter into a contract, we, the engineers, we would do the first draft of the contract based on the employer's requirements. That would then go to the Attorney General's chambers for their analysis. And as per the standard bidding document, which is a part of the procurement law, it sets out the role of the engineer, and it's like 10 pages, the role of the owner, 3 pages, and the role of the contractor. So the roles of the different persons under the contract is very prescriptive. And the thesis is, this same document is used in Saudi Arabia, it's used in Russia, it's used in China. The thesis is that to the extent that these protocols are observed, at the end of the day, you'll get the desired product. And if you don't, then it provides for redress. So that's a general concept.
Mr. Chairman, I noticed that there's one provision in there where, let's say you are the owner's representative, and you fail to issue a certificate which is due, say, on January 1, and you fail to do so within, say, 45 days of the completion of the works, and there's a dispute. I see a provision there where the government of Jamaica is obliged to pay something like 30% per day of each day for delay. Is that an acceptable position that we?
Again, Member Campbell, just the same way that most contracts specify a penalty to the contractor if he doesn't deliver on time, that's called liquidated damage. The contractor, there's usually a provision that if the owner or the engineer do not give the contractor reasonable instruction and reasonable time for him to do whatever, then you can't levy liquidated damage. And there's also a variation to that thesis that the contractor can claim on you. So then now, specifically what you're relating to is that assuming that the contractor does do the work, all the contracts specify the time which is to be paid. And a lot of contractors would insist on having an interest clause in the contract. That's it. If you fail to pay me, I think it's usually 28 days after the certificate is signed. If you don't pay him within that time, he can levy the interest clause. Now, generally, you kind of use superior position to get out of the enforcement of that clause. But a lot of contractors, especially in a high interest rate regime at the banks, they usually insist on a penalty if you don't pay them on time. But that is a part of the contract which the two parties to the contract agree to.
Thank you. Members, are there any more questions? No more questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Hunter, and your team. Members, I just want to canvass how you think we should proceed. It's after 1 o'clock. I think it may be appropriate for us to discontinue the proceedings for today, and when we resume, we would have the NWC, unless others feel differently.
Mr. Chairman, my position is that they are already here, and the ministry has to come back here tomorrow. I think it might be unreasonable to ask them to come back another day. So we should just conclude.
You want us to go through it?
Yes.
Okay, no problem.
Back here.
That's fine with me.
Horace, these are the things that you have to do. So.
Michael.
No, but Marcus is sitting. Put this water.
God.
Oh, God, Peter.
And it was sitting. It's not, but I did tell you I was going to do it.
but it's all right. I'll deal with it. I'll deal with it.
All right, welcome, Mr. Barnett. The team, I'll ask the Auditor General to do our usual opening remarks.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I provided copies of the extract from our 2016 annual report in relation to the financial assessment conducted of the NWC, not for discussion, but just for reference in case the members want to have a better idea of the financial performance of the NWC over the number of years. Now, Mr. Chairman, as I said, I want to just put it in a financial context. And based on our assessment, it reveals that NWC has recorded financial losses for quite a number of years, starting with 2009, 2010. I'm sure it goes beyond that, but I'm looking from that period. With the up to 2016-17, and 16-17 represents the unaudited results, to the best of my knowledge, with the exception of 2013, where due to high operational expenses and significant debt service obligations, among other expenses. So whereas NWC's operating revenue arises primarily from the supply of water, sewage, and service charges, increases in the non-revenue generated water supply continued to erode its earning capacity. It is in this context that we undertook the performance audit to determine whether or not the NWC is managing its procurement activities and implementing capital projects effectively, efficiently, and economically in order to meet the needs of its stakeholders and achieve value for money. Again, this is in the context of the financial losses experienced by NWC, where we believe that these losses, makes it more important that there is effectiveness in the cost delivery of the projects and a reduction in the non-revenue water losses. So we reviewed 50 contracts totaling $6 billion, 151 million US and euros 155 million pertaining to 17 capital projects for the period April 2011 to December 2016, based on the potential impact on the stakeholders. And we found that NWC generally adhered to the government of Jamaica's procurement guidelines relating to bidding, evaluation, and the award process. However, we found deficiencies in the scoping, execution, and monitoring of these contracts, which resulted in increased costs of Jamaican 667 million and US 6.2 million, respectively. And we determined as well that there is a combined time overrun of 126 months. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you for that summary of your findings, Madam Auditor General. So the issues are not so primarily a failure to comply with the procurement rules that are binding on you, but more issues around how you go about preparing for contracts and how you go about executing them and the time frames involved in the various steps. And clearly, in instances which have been cited, there have been costs to the public purse, and well, to your organization and ultimately the public purse, as a result of what are perceived to be governance, for want of a better word, governance failings in relation to how the processes are managed. And I know that you have some responses to some of these criticisms. So I would invite you to respond at this point to the question of these 17 contracts where these criticisms were are levied, where there were increased costs and of 667 million Jamaican dollars and 6.2 million US. And the deadlines, the contractual deadlines, were largely not adhered to, resulting in a combined overrun of 126 months, which I think averages just over 7 months per contract. So perhaps you could give a response to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me wish every member in the chamber a Happy New Year. And as is customary, this is about the second audit by the Auditor General's Department that I have had. And we at NWC must first indicate that we do welcome these reviews because it actually helps in our own processes. And sometimes it's always best to have that external observation reviews. But just to say, Mr. Chairman, between financial year 2010-2011 and 2016-2017, the NWC's portfolio of capital works projects include in excess of 58 projects, comprising approximately 140 contracts. And the estimated value of these contracts total $44.26 billion. The vast majority of these projects, Mr. Chairman, have been completed as the Auditor General would have indicated. Our procurement process is compliant in most cases, within the contract sum and within the time of completion. Now, specifically relating to the projects which the Auditor General have identified, and it is numbering just about 5 or so projects out of the 50 that were reviewed. The tank and pump is one, the Santa Cruz water supply replacement, the Sector F sewage improvement, the Yalas diversion, and the Arbor View reconstruction of the sewage treatment plant, plus 26 facilities. I want to just briefly state that the NWC contract management efforts is aimed at achieving efficiency and, however, oftentimes disrupted by challenges in the timeliness and availability of cash. Now, a lot of these projects are dependent on the cash flow on a daily basis or on a monthly basis. And therefore, even with the best effort of your projection of executing a particular project, if the cash flows are not realized as you would have projected, then it would actually have an impact on those projects. And that is one area. One of the things I also need to mention, the required annual budget based on all the demands for water and sewage services island-wide is just about $28 billion per annum. Our capital budget, on average over the last, I say 5 years, is no greater than $6 billion. And therefore, and that in itself also reflects what the fiscal space is that is allowed by the Ministry of Finance to the entity. But again, fiscal space is not going to be allowed unless there's a demonstration of your ability to actually finance these projects. And so there are changes as it relates to these projects that have been identified for financing as it relates to how do we include a project in our portfolio on a given year, and therefore projects as it is going forward are not considered unless the financing arrangement is in place. And that is what we committed to ensure happens. Unlike in the past, there were projects that would have been considered for various reasons and where the financing had to be looked at subsequent. But regarding the specific projects, and I think I want to go straight to those, because those are substantially what resulted in the first the findings and secondly the recommendations from the Auditor General's Department. So I'll deal firstly with Sector F. Sector F, Mr. Chairman, was a project which was deemed an emergency project. And in the context of an emergency, by virtue of what was happening in the community of Majestic Garden at the time, it was considered both a public health and an environmental threat, not just to the immediate residents in the community, but a wider population. As you know, anything that flows on that southern belt goes into the Hunts Bay. The Hunts Bay in itself is a critical area for fishing, etc. And so the decision was taken to declare an emergency, albeit with an illustrative budget of $745 million to undertake the work. And that illustrative budget was done without any pre-assessment as to the level of intervention that would be required. Intervention subsequently resulted in the redesigning of the sewage in the community. It requires serious ongoing cleaning because, again, and I heard the argument from NEPA earlier, the propensity of using sewers as a garbage dump transcends all communities across the highland that we do operate this system. This is just one of those communities that was so affected. So an immediate thorough cleaning had to be done. The design has to be done that will now inform the actual nature of the work to be executed. And so while the $745 million at the time was contracted, it was contracted without the full knowledge of the extent of the exercise that had to be undertaken. And so when you completed the design activities, the overall sum was revised. I must also point out that notwithstanding the revision and our subsequent submission through the approval process, part of our activity to ensure that value for money, not just because of a revised quantity as it relates to both scope and value, we engage an independent quantity surveyor to ensure that what was determined to be the current value is actually what transcends both in terms of current market rates at the time as well as in terms of the scope. So the overall project did in fact increase to more than $1 billion based on what had to be executed. And we must also point it out, although the final sum to which was approved, the contract, the final sum that was expended was less than what was eventually approved as the project sum, which was about 4 or 5% less than the overall sum. With regards to the crew facilities, just by way of a quick background, and I intend to be as brief as possible. Crew, and this is the Caribbean Regional Water and Wastewater Management Fund. It's really a pilot project that was established between 4 Caribbean islands. Jamaica was selected as one. We undertaken an assessment to identify and prioritize which of the wastewater treatment facilities could be included under this pilot program. The pilot program was financed both by the IDB and the Global Environment Fund, who provided a $3 million US grant funding as seeding, so that the NWC in turn could then approach commercial banks for financing of the remaining funding. It was estimated at the time that 13 facilities could be financed by about $15 million US to rehabilitate. Now, when you do illustrative budget, Mr. Chairman, that's just an illustration. The rubber really hits the ground when you go to tendering, and different bidders start to put in their own costs after the full detailed bill of quantities would have been developed after those assessments. And so, in the process of the tendering, we were well advanced in the procurement process. In fact, we were probably just about at the stage of receiving cabinet approval for the first lot as they were segregated for two facilities. However, in that process, the legislative arrangement as it relates to sludge and sewage regulation by NEPA changed. So the designs were predicated on a previous effluent standard. In the middle of the process, the standard changed. Now we have to make adjustments in the execution. And the standard remedy, rather than going back to tender, which in fact would have not been suitable based on the fact that this is a program being supported by two of our global partners, as well as the limited time frame in which this pilot project ought to have been executed or even commenced. And so the remedy that was utilized, as it would be consistent when you enter into contracts, is to do a variation based on the changes. Both changes would have occurred in the overall layout of the facility, and this predominantly occur at Ellison Flats because of the limited land space that was there, as well as additional process step that had to take care of the increased effluent quality, which is now predicated on the current effluent standard. And that is what informed the changes as it relates to the crew project. The comments of the Auditor General report state that 13 facilities were identified. But when you advance in terms of securing financing and what you have been able to secure from our commercial enterprise, and based on the overall tenders that were received, the 13 facilities could not fit in the budget space. And there the natural process would have to be to reduce the number of facilities that could be attended to. And so that is what was done, as we had no other arrangement to ensure that additional financing could be secured. Let me make sure I'm actually going right. So crew. Okay, Chairman, the issue regarding the tank and pump, and I know a lot of the members in this chamber is very keen to understand about the tank and pump. I would be the first to state that when the tank and pump was first promoted back then, it was promoted and gives an impression that the resources was readily available through K-factor. And so there was great expectation at the time. The reality of the situation was actually absolutely not consistent with that expectation. The funds were never sitting down in a bank available to be expended. The funds would have to be generated on an ongoing basis to be channeled into this program, and the program would have been expected to be pursued over a period of time. The report suggests that the project was, there are two items in this particular area, and I'm going to quickly address them, Mr. Chairman. One, the scoping of the tank and pump was really not the issue. The issue predominantly is really how the financing is available. However, just by information, Mr. Chair, currently the tank and pump program is phased and is currently being executed as we speak. And in fact, our current status on this program is that we have completed 15% of the works, and although the budget at the time was $8.1 billion, for the 15%, we have only expended 4% of the budget. And if that trend continues, we are expecting to be spending less than what was even budgeted in this arrangement. The issue also arose regarding a matter of procurement of particular items. We contend that whether the items were procured inclusive in a contract or exclusive as they were from inception of the process, it would tantamount to about the same in terms of what the value is, because you're buying unit item, and those prices would invariably not change much. Mr. Chairman, a number of factors affect contract administration, and there's always the thinking and the feeling that when there is variation in a contract, it is as a result of some underlying deficiencies. We're not dismissing the fact that there's need for improvement, but in a contract arrangement, as was explained by the previous speaker, Mr. Hunter, once you engage in a contract governed by certain conditions, there are certain remedies that must be applied to a contract. Number one, if a contract, most of the inputs are overseas related, meaning foreign exchange related, once the foreign currency changes, whether it be euro or US dollar, depending on, and those are the places predominantly that we do import purchases, adjustments will have to be taking place. It's going to be a variation. When there are changes in the local construction industry labor
Just on a
rate,
point of order, isn't that a fluctuation rather than a variation?
it's a fluctuation. But it does affect the final price of the contract, because it will be looked at what was tendered, what was contracted at the time, versus what you eventually paid out. So it does impact the overall cost, or let's say the overall expenditure.
In local currency.
In local currency. When there are labor rate changes, and in some instances, labor fluctuation, and there are also certain material fluctuation as well, and even equipment fluctuation. And what you find is, once there's changes on your local petrol, etc., spare part, etc., where a contractor had to use equipment, those likely changes are going to impact the contract that you have in place. Where am I now? Which one you remember, please? Okay, Mr. Chairman, there's one that is, there are two matters which I'm going to address simultaneously, and these are related to wastewater, our wastewater enforcement issues, both at Yalas and at Harborview. Now, Harborview in itself goes back some time, but I will address the issue relating to Yalas first. Yalas was we had a wastewater treatment plant at Yalas. Some persons call it poor man's corner, layman. One of the hurricanes actually damaged significantly the treatment facility. Not completely. There are certain treatments that was happening at the facility. And in the process, the contemplation was whether to reconstruct at the same location, but knowing very well that the likely possibility of another flood damage from the Yalas River could create a similar occurrence sometime in the future. We received a notice from the St. Thomas Parish Council in December, as the Auditor General would indicate. We took some time to look at the different options. And the different options that were considered was, as I indicated earlier, reconstruct, number one. Number two, whether to put in a different type of system on a temporary basis. And number three, whether to transfer the existing generated waste to another location some distance to the west, to West Albion, to a facility that was owned by another agency, which since our involvement, it was subsequently transferred to NWC. So we look at the options, and it took us...
Just a minute, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, yes.
I spoke earlier on of, confine ourselves to the performance audit. But we didn't mention the St. Thomas or the Harbour View. So
Harbour View is mentioned.
Harbour View is mentioned. Yes, Harbour View is mentioned based on the overrun.
Yeah,
but not on the scoping and monitoring, but not about rebuilding and replacing. So not about rebuilding and replacing. So it's best we just confine ourselves to what is listed there. It means we'll complete quicker. But what the area that he's addressing now, that is in the annual report to Parliament. So that should be addressed when we come back here to deal with the annual report from the Auditor General. So what we need to do is also confine ourselves to the concern that the Auditor General raised in the follow-up performance audit.
And he said he was doing them both but
the
Harbour View and...
No, but Harbour View didn't deal with what he's talking about, dispensing and what have you, and relocating. It dealt basically with the contract, scoping, and monitoring of the contract. So what I'm saying, we should confine ourselves to the performance audit, because as I said, what the President is talking about, those are issues for the annual report that we deal with in the regular PAC meeting. So we should confine ourselves.
I wasn't sure yet where he was actually going with this, but yes, I was giving him a chance to, Yes, go on.
So,
Member.
One second. In supporting what Member Warmington has said, I would like to draw our attention to page 9 of the document recommendation, Capital Projects Auditor General Report. I would really like to know 1 and 2. NWC should strengthen its scoping and implementation of contracts to identify critical elements for the successful implementation of projects and achievement of these contracts. 1. NWC should also monitor contracts throughout implementation to minimize losses from incomplete projects. As we said before to Mr. Hunter, you have to monitor the public purse, the taxpayers of country. And I want to know in these 2 recommendations, what has happened? Because
Member Daly, he was, I think, applying, insofar as those observations have been made, recommendations have been made, they've been cited in the context of certain projects where that was not on the face of it done. And I think he's attempting to explain what are the reasons why those criticisms may not be so fair on the or exculpatory aspects. But the
Thank you. All right, Mr. Chairman, I will just I will err on the side of caution and just focus on what was raised by Member Daly here as it relates to the recommendations, and I think that is at the back end. So, what have we done? And we have provided some responses. Some responses to the AG. Number one of the first thing of doing projects, you develop a comprehensive procurement plan. We have improved, I believe, our corporate governance, including agreement on a fixed capital program, which projects selected based on objective and transparent criteria, allocation of additional technical resources to procure and manage the capital program. And we have initiated, as part of the findings of the Auditor General, the delay in executing some of the contracts. And I want to put it in terms of contracts, Mr. Chairman, as opposed to projects, because projects start from a different level. But in terms of when you reach in a project at the contract stage, which would be a milestone, there is usually delay. So you'd have done a series of activities up to the contract stage. So What we have done is to ensure that projects that were delayed, we have now commenced their implementation, and there is an annex which we, in terms of the list of projects, which can be spoken about. And we have also critically framing the capital projects plan to match the available funds, because that was a significant drawback in how NWC were executed. And ostensibly reason why, Mr. Chairman, there's a myriad of issues as it relates to water and wastewater services island-wide. And every member councillor wants to see something as it relates to water supply. And we do in NWC want to do that as well. But the reality of the situation is, while in our exuberant behavior to try to assist every single person, we ended up running into some of these problems. But it's not a lack of not wanting to impact those circumstances, but the reality comes back at the end to say that it is not really executed efficiently. And so we have taken a step back, and we are not pursuing projects unless the financing are in place to undertake those projects, because we are going to be faced with another audit probably 5 years down the road raising the same thing, and we don't want to have a repeat of that situation at all.
In terms of your internal arrangements for trying to minimize delays, minimize the risks inherent in proceeding without a clear picture of what you're actually going to end up doing and what it will cost, what are the internal arrangements within the NWC to try and to manage those processes efficiently? How are you structured for that?
So a number of things that we have done, Mr. Chairman. We had a situation where multiple departments were executing projects. We have streamlined that to be under one unit. That's the first step. We have also strengthened our procurement unit, albeit there still need to be some beefing up, notwithstanding, but it has now been streamlined into a more functional and time-bound unit. We have also ensure from an annual perspective the overall program of activities where we have and I use the term carryover projects, meaning projects that span multiple years. Those are priority, because one of the things that we are mindful of is whatever was spent before, those projects need to take into finality so as to realize the benefits from those projects. And once we are getting those additional space from those completed projects, that's when we'll add new projects into the mix. We know the limitations as it relates to what may be available in terms of what we can do and what we are allowed to execute as it relates to other requirements or other considerations based on the Ministry of Finance. I hope that
Yes, I mean, those are all useful on the face of them, useful improvements. I mean, what struck me reading the materials before us was to what extent the indicative project sums or scopes often ended up being so far out from what the realities that unfolded. Okay. And one wondered, how is it that there's such a wide divergence between what one sort of looking at it at the outset thinks it's going to be and what it ends up being. Yeah, and that seemed to suggest a lack of careful thought as to what you're really faced with and what it will cost to do it.
And Mr. Chairman, that can be answered in two ways. The projects that usually have these cost variation are those that are declared emergency. And emergency by virtue of what they are, meaning you need to get in, correct the problem, and then you try to sort out the cost after. What we have done instead is to look at two approaches to address emergency issues. It could be a cost-plus approach, or we work alongside with the contractor to finalize the overall scope, because it's not a, emergency does not afford you in many occasions to complete a design that will inform the overall scope. It doesn't allow for that. When I have a threat of in Portland, a pipeline ruptures, I don't have the time to go and say what is the structure of the gabion basket that is going to protect the pipe, and etc., etc. We just have to get in there, do something, return the system back in service. These are the projects that usually incur the additional cost because of the unknown. And when you get in there, the unknowns are usually greater than what you actually anticipated. So predominantly those are the reasons for those overall.
Mr. Chairman, if I could,
yeah.
could just assist the MD as a former chairman of the Water Commission myself. I find that oftentimes we don't make the distinction, which I interrupted the MD earlier, to make the distinction between fluctuations and variations.
Right.
We tend to have very long planning cycles in the Water Commission for projects. And they're often, the initial design work is done, but it takes years before funding is found to support that. The original budget is done is stated in Jamaican dollars. And then just with the foreign exchange movement, you find when its implementation starts 6 years down the road, there's a huge gap. Similarly with labor rates, fuel rates, etc., etc. And the other, so that's in terms of just fluctuations without any
scope change.
Without any failure or negligence on the part of those who did the original design and estimate. It's just the passage of time causes these fluctuations. But the second thing is a lot of Water Commission's works are done underground. And and sometimes under roads, under NWA infrastructure, etc., which until they actually start the works, it is difficult to get a reliable assessment of the subterranean conditions until you start doing it. And so it is a relatively large unknown for them until they actually start the work. And I've seen over the years that Water Commission has got a bad name. Some of it may be deserved, but some of it is just people don't understand the difference in the terms between an overrun being created by a fluctuation or a series of fluctuations in prices due to the passage of time versus variations which some could have been anticipated at the design stage, but many of which could not have been anticipated until the work actually commences. And I think we sort of have to educate ourselves as parliamentarians and the public to these technical aspects, because I think sometimes we beat up on these agencies more than they actually deserve.
I'm sure, Mr. Barnett, that was music to his ears.
Thank you, Member Bunting. I wish, sorry, Chairman.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Yes, Member?
On the non-revenue, the non-revenue,
yes,
water non-revenue side, the water, the issue as to the solid state, because of funding, you have scale back that project, or
okay, so
and where are we now with our target to
which
non-revenue? Okay, I'm going to page 13, 2.7.
In the context of the, Mr. Chairman, in the context of the Auditor General's report, where initially we went to market for 100,000 solid-state meters.
This is the one that you just gave.
Right, solid-state water meters, solid-state cold water meters. I want non-revenue water activities that are taking place. We have installed the 50,000 meters. We have seen incremental increases from customers where these meters have been installed. And so the incremental revenue is now translating into an improved bottom line, if you will, for the region, Kingston and St. Andrew. What we have opted to do, having looked at the performance of these meters, is to further extend this process where we now have a 5-year contractual arrangement with the same metering company, receiving the meters at an even lower cost than what we obtained in 2015. And so we will be installing these meters over the next 5 years, approximately 450,000 meters. And the intention is, Mr. Chairman, and just quickly, oftentimes the NWC is criticized of being inefficient. One of the low-hanging fruit that we consider to start that efficiency process is to ensure that our consumers are efficiently metered. But it also has added advantages which we can discuss in another forum. But the first thing is to ensure whatever you get on your premises is as accurately metered as could be.
Where are we now with the target for non-revenue?
For Kingston and St. Andrew, how the program works, you divide the entire network into smaller zones. We have completed just about 5 or 6 of the zones, and the results were encouraging. In some instances, the non-revenue water had reduced from in excess of 60% down below 30%. And the work will continue. So we do the segmentation of the network across the corporate area, measure the NRW in those segments, and then look at the global NRW for the area. It's the strategy on which NRW activities are pursued, and this is how it is done based on international approaches.
So this is just replacing meters with better meters, or putting in meters where there were no meters?
The NRW activities, Mr. Chairman, include other activities. The meter replacement is just one activity in that process.
Which is what was in the report where I'm asked. But looking even at the briefing here that we got from the Auditor General, and where a lot of this report that came from the Auditor General shows a lack of scope and implementation, hence the additional cost overruns. But I have not gotten, Chairman, a good feeling that there's action in play dealing with these things as an urgent matter. You know, neither from your response nor from the report that we have here. You know, and seeing that the NWC, majority of your projects come from your own source cash flow, really, that we would deal with these matters. And I heard the response from Member Bunting, but it still does not take away the fact that there are some projects that can be dealt with in a way that the costs itself can be contained. And I come back to the pump and tank program, because that one was announced years ago. And how many of the tanks have been installed so far?
We have been. Okay, so it's a tank and pump. Member Phillips, we have installed 4 of the tanks, and 4 are currently being installed. And we have procured, as indicated, I think, 68 pumps.
And the tanks that you have installed so far, have they been commissioned?
I think most have been commissioned, or just about 2. It all depends, because there are other activities that has to be done. The tank and pump as it is envisioned, is a tank, upgrading the network, and installation of a pump if it is part of that
a part of
program.
The program itself. So you're satisfied of where we are now?
I wouldn't say satisfied. I cannot. You know, Member Phillips.
Because I know that is a part of dealing with your non-revenue also.
And energy efficiency. So we have to put the two together because there's that energy-water nexus. I would not say that I'm satisfied, but considering the limitations that we face in terms of resources, I just may point out to you, Member Phillips. In 2015-16, when we had one of the worst droughts, we had one of the lowest level of revenue. We had a payment commitment from our customers, which is low. So we ended up running an amnesty so as to beef up our collection. So I can still maintain my commitment to the lending agencies who, if we default, is another story. And so when you have to divert and you have a foreign exchange that impact significantly on my P&L, it therefore divert whatever resources I could use to push into a program to address adequately some of the delays.
All right. Is there anything that you can add to this report in basically just as a committee telling us some of the actions that you have already taken from this report in dealing with the the cost overruns and some of the implementation, streamlining of projects?
Okay, one of the things that we indicated, we have done a number of things. I think I had mentioned a few earlier, but also failed to mention, and I will just do that now. There are certain works which were considered emergency. Notwithstanding, we try within 24 hours to get competing bids. And that's a tall ask from contractors. But some persons will respond. And that, in the whole issue of value for money and so forth, we make those adjustments, and it also depending on the type of work that we're executing. So I had a sewer collapse on the boulevard, probably about 80 meters or 100 meters. I will then ask somebody, it is unlikely that you'll see anything significantly underground. So put in a contingency sum, but give me what the real estimate. 2 persons would respond. We then move with the most economical one in comparison to the next, and we move. So these are some of the adjustments that we have made, in addition to the things that I've listed earlier in terms of streamlining the procurement, streamlining how contract is executed. Rather than have it spread over multiple units, it is now streamlined under a single unit, so we have better control over that process.
All right. Anything else? Thank you very much, Mr. Barnett and team.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Well,
Thank you, members.
It's been a long session. Yes. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to conclude the minutes. We have gone through each of the pages. There was one issue on page 3 of the minutes, and it was a statement attributed to Member Bunting, and in the penultimate paragraph on page 3 of the minutes, and he agrees that the word not should be inserted after the word were. So it would say, noting that if this were not the case, etc. With that change, could I ask for the adoption of the minutes? Would someone so move? Thank you. Seconded? Seconded by Mr. Thank you very much. Any other business? There's no other business. Date of next meeting? I see the clerk reaching for the calendar, so let us see what's available. Okay, so what, the 30th? The 30th is available. That's the next available Tuesday. So can we agree? It's Tuesday the 30th. Yeah. Yeah. There's a joint select committee sitting next week, Tuesday. All right? Thank you. Thank you, Madam Auditor General. Thank you, your team. See you again in 2 weeks' time.